Hello, you've just tuned into a night of flavor with the Flavivirus.
You like that sultry voice? What's awkward is the 1.7 speeders probably heard me in my normal voice trying to be sultry. And I'm gonna stop saying sultry now. I'm creeping myself out. Okay, anyway, this scene is about Flavivirus. This was gonna take place at Flavor Flav's house, but our lawyers advised against it. And by lawyers, I of course mean the voices. Alright, this scene is set at a party along the Nile. Notice that we're using a lot of yellows and oranges, warm colors for a warm desert, which means that we're in RNA territory. For the astute observers, you'll notice it's a daytime scene, which means that Flavivirus is a positive sense RNA virus. Alright, let's draw in some party goers. Notice it's a toga party. This is to remind you that Flavivirus is an envelope virus, just as these robes are enveloping the partygoers. Also, it makes sense for people near the Nile to be wearing robes. At least biblically speaking, it makes sense. And for the most part, I'm usually biblically speaking. Now, the Flavivirus group is made up of several viruses, most of which we'll cover in this video. However, one Flavivirus is special enough to get a video all on its own, and that's Hep C. However, to remind you that Hep C is a Flavivirus, we quickly put it in this video too as a fruit punch station. Remember drinking Hi-C as a kid? Well, this Nile party is sponsored by the less popular fruit drink, Hep C. Yum. Also notice that the straw in the juice box is not one of those bendy types, but it's a single straw. This can help you remember that Flavivirus contains only a single segment of RNA. Or in other words, they're non-segmented. Alright, now let's travel along the Nile and meet the rest of the big shot Flaviviruses. The first virus will be illustrated with this brown rubber dinghy floating in the river. This dinghy stands for dengue, as in dengue fever. Or you could just call it dinghy fever. Alright, now check out this guy in the boat. He doesn't look very happy. He's sweating and feverish and is desperately swatting off mosquitoes. And what kind of mosquitoes? Does it matter? Probably not, but it might. So if you are asked what species it is, it's Aedes aegypti. I'm probably not pronouncing that right, but it's written here. And these mosquitoes are the vector for dengue fever. Dengue virus infects the bone marrow. In fact, another name for dengue fever is breakbone fever. There are 4 types of dengue fever, but type 2 is the most important, and that's what this guy in the dinghy has. So let's add an oar, but have the handle be made out of bone. And notice that the oar is being broken into 2 pieces. This will be your cue for the buzzword breakbone in breakbone fever, and because it's in 2 pieces, hopefully you'll remember that we're illustrating type 2 of dengue fever. So going back to breakbone, what do you think are some of the things that can happen when the virus messes with your bone marrow? Well, you won't be able to produce as many platelets, for one. So patients can develop thrombocytopenia, which will increase the risk of bleeding. We'll draw in some little red rubber life preservers floating around next to them, and these represent red blood cells. This will help you remember that dengue fever is a type of hemorrhagic fever. You also might have noticed that this dinghy looks an awful lot like one of our dinghies from a previous video. It's the same dinghy that you see in Leptospira. It's kidney-shaped, and these blue and red ribbons hanging off the side kind of look like renal blood vessels. And this is to help you remember that renal failure is one of the more serious complications of dengue fever. Eventually, dengue can lead to septic shock and even death. And death's a pretty bad outcome for an infection. So what can we do to prevent it with modern medicine? Well, this poor dinghy guy clearly got a little too drunk, and his so-called friends at the toga party sent him to float down the river alone to his fate, which is sadly representative of our available treatments. You're kinda on your own if you have dengue. The treatment is mainly supportive, but it's important to make sure that the patient is well hydrated, which our friend who's stranded on the river will certainly be. Okay, so that's all for dengue fever. In the back of the sketch, we'll draw in a yellow African water buffalo. And this is going to represent yellow fever, another flavivirus. And how do you think this virus is transmitted? See these little critters buzzing around the buffalo? You guessed it again, the Aedes mosquito. So the vector for yellow fever is also the same as dengue. So no surprise, but yellow fever causes jaundice. And to make this connection extra memorable, we put a liver-shaped mud spot on this buffalo. So aside from jaundice, yellow fever also causes backache, which is represented by this exaggerated hump on the buffalo's back. Now look at what the guy on the right is standing on. A red stool. Does that look familiar? Think back to our bacteria videos. It's a red stool to represent bloody stool, or bloody diarrhea. And actually in the case of yellow fever, you can also have bloody vomiting. Pretty much blood spurting out of both ends. The good news is that unlike dengue fever, there is a live attenuated vaccine available for travelers, which is represented by this large syringe poking out of the buffalo's back. Now let's move on to another flavivirus that lives near the Nile, the West Nile virus. The Nile bird that you see here should remind you that birds are the reservoir for West Nile virus, and the mosquitoes you see swarming around the birds are the vector that will transmit it to humans. This mosquito species is different from the species for dengue and yellow fever, and they're called the Culex mosquitoes, but I really think this is very low yield. Now look at these red, brain-shaped feathers that the birds have. They kind of look like red turbans, and red turbans are a symbol for encephalitis, which is the major complication of West Nile virus. West Nile virus can also cause myelitis, which can lead to flaccid paralysis. So this bird's neck brace represents the rigidity of meningitis, and the floppy, drooping neck of the bird will represent the flaccid paralysis. Eventually, the infection can lead to seizures and coma. We've represented seizures here by having this bird flapping his wings, and coma, this bird over here, that's passed out and floating down the river. If you perform PCR and serology on a sample of the CSF, you can make a definitive diagnosis. But just like the dinghy man, treatment is only supportive. And now coming full circle, guess where this river is heading? To a sea, specifically Hep C. Hepatitis C is one of the most important flaviviruses you'll encounter, which is why we've made it its own video. The Hep C hippo here, though, is not to be confused with his Hep A cousin. Hep C hippo is kind of more badass. He has an earring that's shaped like a C. But he too has a liver-shaped mud splatter to help you remember that hepatitis C causes hepatitis. Or liver inflammation. Tricky. Anyway, this is just a preview of what's to come in our Hep C video. That's all we've got for Flavy. So I'll
catch you on the flip side.